Today's narration of the Passion of the Lord is a narration of Jesus' life from the Last Supper until his death and burial. Why do we call Jesus' suffering just before his death his passion? Generally, this is not properly understood. We tend to think that passion here refers to intense sufferings. Yes, that is not wrong, but we can also miss a key point. Passion comes from the Latin passio, meaning passiveness, non-activity, absorbing something more than actively doing anything. So the passion of Jesus refers to that time in his life where his meaning for us is not defined by what he was doing, but rather by what was being done to him. The public life and ministry of Jesus can be divided into two parts. Jesus spent about 3 years preaching and teaching before being put to death. For most of that time, except the last days, he was very much the doer, like most of us, the doer. He was in command. He was the active one, teaching, healing, performing miracles, giving counsel, eating with sinners, debating with religious authorities. Generally, by all kinds of activities, he was inviting the people into the life of God. And he was busy, very busy. He was at times so pressured by people that he didn't even have time to eat. Therefore, for almost all of his public life, Jesus was so-called actively doing something. However, from the time he walked out of the Last Supper room and began to pray in Gethsemane, that activity stopped. He was no longer the one who was doing things for others, but the one who was having things done to him in the garden. They arrested him. They bound his hands. They led him to the high priest and to Pilate. He was beaten, humiliated, stripped of his clothes, and eventually nailed to a cross where he died. That was his passion. That time in his life and ministry where he was no longer the so-called the doer and became the one who had things done to him. Our faith teaches us that we are saved more through his passion, his suffering, death, than through all his activity of preaching and teaching and doing miracles. How does that work? A priest shared the story of his sister who was a nun who died of cancer. She was a nun for more than 30 years. This nun loved her religious vocation very much, And she was also very much loved by the people. Just like Sister Enda, the FMM sister. For most of those 30 years, she served hundreds of young women who had attended a school run by her religious order. She loved those young women and was for them a mother, an older sister, a mentor. For the last 20 years of her life, after her own mother died, she also served in that same capacity for her family. She organized, good organizer. She organized and kept the family together. So through all those years, she was the active one, the doer, the one that others expected to take charge. And she enjoyed the role. She loved doing things for others, serving others. Then 9 months before she died, cancer struck her badly. And she spent the last months of her life bedridden. Now, things needed to be done for her and to her. Doctors, nurses, her sisters in community and others, doctors taking care of her. And like Jesus, from the time of his address and until the moment of his death, her body too was humiliated, led around by others and stripped. That is what happened when we are paralyzed and bedridden. This was her passion. She, the one who has spent so many years doing things for others, serving others, now she had to submit. She had to surrender to having things done to her. But like Jesus, when she was so-called helpless and no longer in charge, she was able, in that period of her life, to give life and meaning to others and touch others in a deeper way than she could when she was active and doing so many things for others. How? Simply through the weakness of her faith, her ability to let go, the calm, joyful, and serene manner she accepted what had happened to her, the weakness of her faith. These, sisters and brothers, could be a very common experience which we all witness in our own family, relatives and friends and parishioners, perhaps even your own selves. So this is a great lesson in this on how we see those terminally ill, those severely handicapped and the sick, on how we might understand ourselves when we are old or ill, helpless, bedridden, and think that we are useless and in need of care from others, totally dependent on others. This is the typical experience of poverty of spirit. Even right now, this person, this priest just came to the mind. I think of Father Emela. Is it Father Emela at the old folks' home? He got a stroke. How was his name? Emela. Huh? Amala. Huh? Got a stroke. How many years? 30 years. 30 years on the chair. Before the active, now cannot do the things done to her, but not totally helpless. Not totally helpless. You really experienced the poverty of spirit. So the cross teaches us that we, like Jesus, can still give. We can still give as much to others in our passivities as in our activities. Like those sisters in IJ, they all undergo all this. When we are no longer in charge, no longer in control, humiliated, suffering, and unable even to make ourselves understood by our loved ones, by our children, by our grandchildren, our fellow parishioners, we are undergoing our passion. And like Jesus, have that opportunity to give our love and ourselves to others in a more deeper spiritual way.